I'm Grace Miller, and I built my company from nothing but grit, curiosity, and a deep belief that education could be smarter. I grew up in rural Ohio, where the internet barely reached our farmhouse, and our family dinners were often silent, not because we lacked things to say, but because the work left us too tired to speak. My parents ran a small soybean farm, and every day was about weather debt and survival. They weren't college-educated, but they respected learning more than anyone I've met in Silicon Valley. My mom would set aside parts of her sewing money to buy me secondhand books, and my dad used to say, "You fix your future the same way you fix a fence, one wire, one post, one blister at a time." I didn't think of myself as exceptional, just focused. While other kids were trying to beat Mario Kart, I was teaching myself to code on a library computer that still had a floppy disk drive. I earned a scholarship to Purdue and later a spot in a competitive AI lab that barely had any women. Most of my colleagues saw me as someone who must have gotten lucky or had a connection. I had neither. What I had was stamina and a chip on my shoulder that turned out to be great fuel. After graduation, I turned down safe jobs and started my own AI firm out of a garage in Cincinnati. My first client was a charter school that couldn't afford traditional software. I built them a tool that adapted reading levels in real time. It wasn't fancy, but it worked. That product became the seed of EduVerge, which now powers AI learning platforms in over 20 countries. I've been told my story is impressive, but honestly, it still feels close to the ground. I never set out to build an empire. I just saw something broken in education and thought I could fix it. Every major leap we've made has come from listening closely to problems no one else wanted to touch. Today, they call me a tech mogul. I still think of myself as that girl in muddy boots printing out Java tutorials at the public library. I've made my share of mistakes, but I've learned to listen carefully, to prepare quietly, and to act when it counts. And that's exactly what I had to do when I realized the man I trusted most had been preparing to betray me. I met Ethan at a TEDx event I sponsored in Boston. He wasn't one of the speakers or the kind of guy working the room with business cards. He stood quietly near the back during my talk, nodding along as I explained how adaptive AI could transform childhood literacy. Afterwards, while I was answering a cluster of questions near the stage, he waited. Not impatiently, just watching like he was genuinely interested in the ideas. When the crowd thinned, he introduced himself as a pediatric neurologist from Seattle who worked with underserved communities. I remember being caught off guard by how easy it was to talk to him. Most men either seemed intimidated by my work or too eager to prove they weren't. Ethan didn't do either. He asked thoughtful questions, laughed at my dry jokes, and didn't once mention anything about money or tech. We grabbed coffee that turned into dinner. The conversation was steady and effortless. He told me about his work with kids who had traumatic brain injuries and how frustrating it was that medical tech often ignored the poor. I told him how our AI struggled with bias and how we were trying to fix that by feeding it multilingual, non-standardized datasets. For the first time in a long while, I felt seen. Not as Grace the CEO or Grace the headline, just Grace. And Ethan never acted like he was impressed by my title. He was just curious, kind, and present. Our relationship moved quickly, but it never felt rushed. Within 6 weeks, we were flying across the country to visit each other. By month 3, we were spending long weekends in the same city and talking about furniture as if it were obvious we'd share a home soon. He was gentle in a way that made me soften. I'd spent years on edge, always bracing for skepticism or power plays. With him, I could exhale. 10 months in, on a quiet morning in Vancouver, after we'd hiked to a secluded overlook, he proposed with a simple gold band. He didn't make a big speech. He just looked at me and said he didn't want to keep imagining life together. He wanted to start it. I said yes without hesitation. We married 4 months later in a garden behind a historic inn in Vermont with fewer than 40 guests and no press. It was the one time I completely turned off my work phone and left it that way for days. I thought I had found my balance, someone who understood me without needing to compete or control. Looking back, I still wonder how much of it was real. Not all lies wear masks. Some look like warmth, feel like safety, and walk you right into the fire. But back then, I believed. And loving him felt like the smartest, safest decision I had ever made. The first signs were so subtle, I almost missed them. Ethan started asking little questions about the company, nothing that felt invasive, just curious. He'd glance over my shoulder while I checked a quarterly report and ask what a specific line item meant or how we structured our international partnerships. At first, I chalked it up to natural interest. We were married after all. It wasn't strange for a husband to want to understand his wife's business. But it kept happening. He'd mention a friend of a friend who specialized in financial planning or ask if we'd ever thought about diversifying into offshore markets. Once, after a board meeting, I came home to find a notepad on the kitchen counter with my revenue projections scribbled across it. Ethan said he was just curious how we forecast international growth. I smiled, told him it was proprietary, and laughed it off. I wanted to believe it was harmless. Ethan wasn't in finance. He was a doctor. The idea that he might be looking into my business with ulterior motives seemed paranoid. I was used to guarding against external threats, not the person I shared a bed with. When he started traveling more for work, I didn't question it. He was in demand. Conferences, panels, and guest surgeries at out-of-state hospitals. But I noticed his itineraries were vague. He stopped sharing flight info or conference names. If I asked for details, he'd wave it off and say it was just a boring roundtable or a last-minute call. There were other things. Passwords were changed on his devices, a lock screen where there hadn't been one before, and once I walked into the study and saw him quickly minimize a spreadsheet. He said it was patient data. I didn't push. I was in the middle of launching a pilot program in Toronto. The team was under pressure. Investors were circling for a new round, and I was trying to secure funding without giving up too much equity. I told myself I was just tired reading into things. Ethan was stressed too. That's all it was. We stopped talking the way we used to. Our dinners got shorter. His phone stayed face down on the table. I blamed myself for being distracted, for bringing work home, for not showing enough interest in his life. I even started planning a surprise weekend getaway just to reset. But the unease kept creeping in. I'd find him staring at my home office bookshelf where I kept older contracts and financial archives. Once I came home early and saw him flipping through my business journal. He said he was looking for a note I'd written about a nonprofit idea we'd discussed. It was a good excuse, too good. I'm not proud of how long I rationalized the inconsistencies. I'd spent years building a company on logic and analysis, but when it came to love, I defaulted to hope. I didn't want to believe the man who'd stood beside me through every milestone might be hiding something. And maybe part of me knew that the moment I questioned it, everything would change. So I kept smiling. I kept working. I kept pretending that nothing was wrong, until the day I couldn't pretend anymore. It started with something simple. I was looking for a photo from our honeymoon to print for our anniversary card. Ethan had taken most of them on his old iPad, the one that usually stayed tucked away in a kitchen drawer we never used. I powered it on without thinking, expecting nothing but a gallery of beach sunsets and bad selfies. The home screen blinked to life, and the email app was already open. I almost closed it out of habit, but a subject line caught my eye. It wasn't dramatic. Just 4 words: asset evaluation, private inquiry. I stared at it for a long time. My thumb hovered above the screen as a dozen reasons to walk away crowded my head. Maybe it was medical. Maybe it was a consulting project. Maybe it was nothing. But then again, maybe it wasn't. My heart pounded hard enough to feel it in my throat. I tapped. The email opened slowly like it knew what it was holding. At first, all I saw were names, a law firm I didn't recognize, a reply thread, an attachment labeled Valuation Summary. My hands felt numb. I tried to breathe evenly, telling myself this was probably something benign. Maybe Ethan had made an investment he hadn't mentioned. Maybe he was planning something for us. But the tone was clinical. Detached. The kind of language lawyers use when preparing for a division of assets, not a celebration. My stomach twisted. I scrolled down slowly, afraid of what I might see, even as I couldn't stop. That's when I felt it. That quiet, electric stillness right before everything inside you breaks open. I didn't know the whole truth yet. But I knew one thing for sure. Something was terribly deliberately wrong. The email came from a boutique law firm in Miami that specialized in high-net-worth divorces. They weren't asking questions. They were reporting. Attached were spreadsheets, charts, and summaries labeled as confidential analysis of marital and separate assets. My name was everywhere. So was my company's. They had mapped out EduVerge's structure down to its smallest subsidiaries. There were timelines tracking the company's valuation before and after our wedding. They listed accounts I hadn't mentioned in years, investment vehicles I'd set up long before Ethan and I met, and even real estate transactions that were buried deep in trust documentation. It wasn't curiosity. It was an excavation. Every detail had been dug up, categorized, and monetized. I kept scrolling, numb and breathless, until I hit the part that cracked everything wide open. He had forwarded internal strategy memos. Ones marked private. Ones I had only shared with my executive team. My hands trembled as I read the subject lines. Q2, Forecast Risk Analysis, Singapore Pilot Structuring, M&A Contingency Plans. He hadn't just betrayed me emotionally. He had violated my company, my work, my core. I felt something cold and foreign settle into my chest. This wasn't someone who'd gotten in over his head. This was someone who had planned. There were notes in the thread where he asked the attorneys to verify which parts of my holdings would be easier to access through shared ownership. One reply outlined possible vulnerabilities if assets had been co-mingled during marriage. He responded with timestamps of when he believed that had happened. He was calculating every angle. The final email in the chain was time-stamped just 2 nights ago. He had uploaded my financial snapshot and ended the message with a chilling phrase. Target confirmation pending. All data aligns. I closed the iPad and just sat there. Not crying? Not yet. Just hollow. He hadn't been building a life with me. He'd been building a case. And I had handed him the tools without even knowing. I sat in the dark for hours after reading those emails, staring at nothing and everything at once. The shock hadn't worn off, but something deeper had started to form beneath it. A kind of stillness, sharp and cold, like the surface of a frozen lake. At sunrise, I texted Selena. She was my first ever lawyer and the one person I trusted with both my company and my history. We met at her office 3 hours later. No assistance, no distractions. I didn't cry. I laid out the facts like puzzle pieces, each one stained with betrayal, but arranged with surgical precision. Selena didn't flinch. She nodded as I talked, occasionally jotting notes, but mostly watching me with the look of someone who had been waiting for me to see what she already suspected. When I was done, she leaned forward and said one word. Contain. That became our strategy. We started with a full asset trace, bank accounts, corporate structures, pre-NEEP trusts, everything. Selena had helped me establish a Delaware trust years ago, back when I first launched EduVerge, and that became our fortress. Most of my IP was still registered under that entity. Untouched, untainted. Next came the firewall. We pulled in a discreet forensic analyst to check every digital trail and confirmed what I feared. Ethan had accessed my work laptop remotely on at least 4 occasions. That gave us cause to lock down internal systems and reroute sensitive communications through a separate encrypted channel. Then, we restructured optics. Selena drafted a series of internal board memos, timestamped and justified, tying our upcoming Asia expansion to market pressures I had already been analyzing. She reminded me that preparation wasn't deception. It was protection. and everything we did from here forward had to appear like business as usual. I wasn't reacting. I was leading, quietly, surgically, deliberately. Selena handled the legal end, while I worked with my CFO to reclassify dormant assets and ensure clean separation of anything that could be argued as commingled. We reviewed years of transactions line by line. By the end of the day, I had signed off on a package that looked less like a defense and more like a blueprint for survival. I left her office with a folder in my bag and a plan in my mind. The grief was still there, curling under my ribs. But it had a rival now: strategy. I had spent a lifetime building this life. I wasn't about to let anyone dismantle it behind my back. He thought I would unravel. Instead, I got organized. I spent the week smiling like a woman in love. I booked spa treatments, browsed vacation outfits, and dropped hints about a surprise dinner on the coast. Ethan played along, his voice syrupy and warm, each word hiding a blade I now knew was waiting. He brought home wine and lit candles, careful to keep up the illusion. What he didn't know was that I wasn't his audience. I was his opponent. Every step he took, I let him believe was his idea while I moved pieces behind curtains he couldn't see. When he asked about the company's performance that quarter, I gave him polished but vague answers. I acted flustered over investor calls, mumbled about market shifts, and casually mentioned a board dispute that didn't exist. The more off balance I made him feel, the more confident he seemed. That's how I knew it was working. At night, I'd watch him scroll through his phone with that smug look he thought was subtle. He probably imagined I was busy planning a romantic escape while he lined up his legal ambush. What I was actually doing was letting him walk straight into a dead end he couldn't see coming. I staged conversations near the kitchen where I knew he could overhear me stressing about logistics, wondering aloud if I'd gotten in over my head with our Canada expansion. He asked careful follow-ups that I pretended not to notice. I let my voice tremble just enough to make it believable. It wasn't revenge I was after. It was control. He thought he was orchestrating the perfect moment to pull the rug out from under me. What he didn't realize was I had already rewoven the rug and laid the trap right beneath his feet. I didn't just know the game. I had redesigned the board. I timed the call for when I knew he'd be in the hallway pretending to look for his keys. My phone was on speaker just loud enough to carry. The voice on the other end was my CFO walking through revised asset allocations for our Singapore entity. I asked questions that sounded nervous, unsure. Should we split the IP registration across the Delaware Trust and the Canadian arm? Would that trigger a compliance audit? I could feel Ethan's footsteps pause just outside the door. I mentioned liquidity thresholds, international taxation buffers, and reclassification timelines. None of it was fake, but all of it was meant to be overheard. When I glanced at him afterward, his smile was thinner than usual. His eyes darted like he was recalculating something he didn't fully understand. That night, he was quieter, less affectionate, more watchful. I watched him scroll his phone longer than usual, jaw-tight fingers twitchy. He asked if I'd been stressed about work. I laughed, said it was nothing new, just scaling pains. He wanted reassurance, but I gave him misdirection. A little doubt, a little confusion, enough to keep him thinking he was still in control. He didn't know he was slipping. Every glance he gave me after that had a flicker of unease, like maybe the woman he'd underestimated wasn't quite where he left her. That's the thing about playing games with people who build systems for a living. We don't just defend, we design failure into your plan before you've even made your move. The divorce papers arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by courier in a sleek envelope that practically smirked. Ethan made sure to be home when I opened it. He stood by the kitchen counter, coffee in hand, wearing that smug blend of regret and professionalism he used with nervous patience. I unfolded the document slowly, each page confirming what I already knew. He wanted half of everything. He cleared his throat, said we should keep things civil efficient. It wasn't personal, just the way these things go. I nodded, as if hearing it for the first time. My hands shook just enough to look authentic. He probably thought I was in shock. He probably thought he'd broken me. I took the weekend, just like he suggested. I let him explain how prolonged litigation would only hurt us both, how fair meant equal. I listened as he offered his version of compassion sprinkled with strategic guilt. He spoke of love as if it were a currency we'd simply overdrawn. On Monday, my legal team responded. Every asset he thought he'd uncovered was documented, dated, and legally isolated. The trust held. The Delaware filings are held. The international allocations were justified by board minutes, timestamps, and independent audits. There was nothing to take. By Wednesday, his tone shifted. Charm gave way to irritation. He accused me of planning this. I didn't respond. On Thursday, he suggested we try therapy. Maybe we were moving too fast. I said I'd think about it. By Friday, he was pacing our living room, voice rising, muttering about unfair tactics and hidden agendas. I stood there silent, unmoved. He never expected the woman he tried to outmaneuver to outplay him so completely. He thought love had made me soft, but he mistook softness for silence. He didn't realize I had been preparing, not reacting. The final blow came when his attorney requested an emergency hearing, claiming I'd shifted assets in anticipation of divorce. My team countered with a 200-page binder of timelines, approvals, and financial logic that had nothing to do with him. The judge dismissed his motion in under 10 minutes. That night, Ethan came home late. He didn't say a word. He just stared at me like seeing someone he hadn't really looked at before. I met his gaze, steady and calm. Not angry, not hurt, just done. He thought he was holding the final card. But I had already built a new deck, and I didn't need to play another hand. Ethan's case collapsed faster than he could spin a new narrative. His attorney withdrew quietly. The law firm that had once admired his charm now whispered about ethics and exposure. 3 of his clients pulled their contracts within a week. The rest followed. His name no longer meant strategy. It meant scandal. He moved out of state and started a modest practice, a far cry from the empire he once thought he'd inherit by proximity. The woman he left me for faded with the fortune. She was gone before the ink on the settlement dried. I didn't follow what happened to him after that. Not because I didn't care, but because I finally understood that healing meant looking forward, not sideways. With the chaos behind me, I turned my focus to something that had been sitting in the back of my mind for years. I founded Rise Forward, a nonprofit focused on financial literacy for women navigating divorce, entrepreneurship, and independence. I poured in the first $1 million myself. We held workshops, offered legal consultations, and partnered with schools to bring real-world money lessons to girls before they ever needed them. That work saved me more than any settlement ever could. It reminded me that what I built mattered beyond my bank balance. It gave the pain somewhere to go. Months later, I met someone. Not in a boardroom, not at a gala, at a volunteer event for veterans where I gave a talk and he handed out blankets. His name is Caleb, and he teaches high school biology. Our first date was a walk and 2 slices of pizza. We talked more about science fiction than strategy. I was cautious. Still am. But there's something grounding in being with someone who doesn't care about quarterly earnings or equity splits. He cares about honesty, eye contact, and how you treat the waiter. That's what I pay attention to now. Losing Ethan didn't break me. It broke the illusion. And in its place, I found something real. Something mine. Something earned. If you've ever trusted someone who let you fall, I want you to know you're not alone. Betrayal doesn't just break your heart. It shakes your sense of judgment, your confidence, and your belief that you know what's real. But here's what I've learned. The pieces don't disappear. You get to choose how to rebuild them. Reclaiming your power isn't about being perfect or getting revenge. It's about remembering your value when someone tries to reduce you to a transaction. It's about making decisions that protect your future, not just your feelings. You can love again. You can trust again. But you do it with your eyes wide open and your voice stronger than before. You don't owe anyone's silence just because they mistook your kindness for weakness. I survived the storm not because I had a plan from the beginning, but because I listened to my instincts when it finally mattered. If you're in the middle of your own storm, pause. Breathe. Start one decision at a time. You don't have to win everything in a day. You just have to stop giving away the pen and start writing the next chapter yourself. So, let me ask you, have you ever had to rebuild after someone tried to rewrite your story without your permission? What helped you take your power back? I'd love to hear, because your voice might be the one someone else needs to hear right now.